Hi, welcome to Cannabasics. Today we're making funky monkey bread, which is a simple one-pot stovetop recipe for cannabis infused pull-apart coffee cake that's sticky, delicious, and so easy a monkey could do it. This episode is sponsored by WeedGrowHub.com, which is an awesome free website for cannabis enthusiasts with a ton of info on growing weed. With their hazy summer promotion, you can also get some free seeds and other prizes, so check them out at WeedGrowHub.com today. So let's get started. Here's what you're going to need. You're going to need a half a cup, that's 1 stick of unsalted butter, 2 grams of dried cannabis flowers, 1/4 cup of sugar, 3/4 teaspoons of ground cinnamon, 2 7.5 ounce packages of canned biscuit dough, and 1/3 cup of brown sugar packed. And you can find all these ingredients and tons more at infusedeats.com. It's a free recipe book of all our recipes from RuffHouse Studios. Check that out if you're over 21. Okay, so now let's get started with the first step, which is going to be to clarify our butter. So take your 1 stick of butter, cube it, and put it into our pan that we're using. In this case, we're using 1 pan for the whole recipe on a stovetop, 1 single eye of a stove. So it's a simple recipe that was submitted by many users who said, I don't have an oven, I don't have this, or I don't have that. And they wanted a really simple 1-pan recipe, so this is what I came up with for that. So for this case, we're using a small, thick bottom frying pan. Now I have my heat on medium-low right now, and what I'm doing is clarifying the butter. Clarifying the butter is separating the milk solids, which is the white stuff that you see me skimming off right there, and I'm just discarding that. And what we're trying to get to is that butter oil, which is the kind of popcorn butter, yellow butter oil that you see beneath there. And if you do this, you're going to have the proper ratios for the recipe as well, because this recipe is intended to use this amount of butter. So make sure you clarify the butter, and you can just discard that milk solids unless you have a use for it. Okay, and now we're going to prepare a cannabis. I've got a couple of grams of cannabis here. Of course, like all recipes, you can vary the amount or the type of cannabis that you use. I'm using 2 grams of some indica, and I have that ground up, taking out all the stems and seeds. Not that there were really any in there. So now I'm putting it in my butter, and I've reduced the heat on my butter down to low. And this one key to this recipe is you need to keep the heat on low the entire time. So if you have a thermometer, that would be great. You want to keep it down to about 220 degrees at the maximum, or the constant temperature would be great. And that brings me to this very important point about this recipe, is that you want to make sure that you keep your temperature consistent, and you want to make sure that you keep it right around 220 degrees. And we're going to let it infuse and activate, decarboxylate, convert the THC acid into THC, which is the psychoactive form of it. And we'll do that while we're infusing the butter at the same time. And it's important that you monitor that temperature and keep it as close to 220 degrees as possible. And if you get your temperature higher than that, you see it's reaching up to almost 250 degrees. Here, you can tell one thing by the color of the butter and the oil and the activity in it. But if that happens, you want to get it up off the heat and make sure that you get the temperature down and do not let it exceed 250 degrees at the maximum. So that's important. So make sure you monitor your temperature for that entire hour of the infusion and activation of the THC. And in that time, you can also go ahead and combine your sugar and your cinnamon and make your cinnamon sugar mixture that you're going to use to coat your dough. And you might as well go ahead and break out your dough as well. And we'll be cutting those little biscuits into half sizes. And then you can take each of those pieces and toss them inside of the sugar and cinnamon mixture. And this is going to be just to coat them all around. You can also put them in a Ziploc bag and shake them up in there like shake and bake. Make sure you have all your biscuits covered and coated. And if you have more than, say, 15 or 20 minutes before your oil is going to be infused, before your hour's up with the infusion, you're going to go ahead and put those in the refrigerator and keep them cold so they don't start expanding. But otherwise, if you time it correctly, you can time it so that you're done with that just about the time that your butter is done, like I've done here. So it's been about an hour on my butter infusion. And I'm going to go ahead and strain that through a fine mesh filter. You could also use cheesecloth or a coffee filter if you really want to strain it out. But for this recipe, it's not really that important. If you have a little bit of the material still floating in there, it's going to be fine. So I just used a fine mesh filter there. I've got my can of butter all ready to go. And I've wiped my pan clean, the original pan. I'm still using that one same small frying pan. And I've taken about 2 tablespoons of the butter and put it back into the frying pan that's on very low heat over there, just very, very low. And then I've taken the remaining can of butter, and which is about a quarter cup, and I've taken the third cup of brown sugar, and I've put it into that other can of butter while it's still nice and warm, almost hot, and melting that brown sugar into that butter. And so that's going to be our topping. So we'll just set that aside for a minute now, and then we'll move back to our pan with our butter that's been warming up in there. And it shouldn't really sizzle. It's on a very low heat here, so you just want to keep it where it's not going to start frying your bread immediately. It's just going to be just barely hot and just going to take a minute before it starts bubbling. And as you pack them all in there, and this is when I realized that 1 can wasn't enough, so the recipe has been adjusted so that it's 1 can plus 3 more biscuits. So that's why the second can. It needs about 10 or 11 ounces. So if you could also use like 1 bigger can, but you need about 10 or 11 ounces of the biscuits all together. But the recipe as written is correct. And so now I've put my biscuits in there. They're packed in so that they're a little puffy and kind of sticking out. And I've taken the rest of that can of butter and sugar, and I'm pouring it over the top of it. And I'm going to spread that out a little bit and make it nice and even, because you want your edibles to be as close to even as possible. But this is a very rough sort of recipe, so you could totally make this at a campsite over a fire if you were really careful with it and diligent. So if it's a little rustic, that's fine. It's going to be really cool at the end. So then if you're using nuts on it, you go ahead and put them on it now too. So I've spread some walnuts out on top there. You can use whatever kind of nuts or none if you want. And then put a lid on it, a nice sealed lid. And you're going to let that cook on that very low heat for about 7 to 8 minutes. I went up almost 10 minutes and it got a little bit brown on the bottom, but actually it tasted perfect, so it really doesn't matter but what you want to do is make sure that it's formed together into a nice cohesive side, because you got to flip it here, which is the trickiest part. You see I lost a couple of little pieces on the end there, but it's no problem. As long as you're careful, you shouldn't have too big of a catastrophe, and I was just able to use a knife and flip them back out, no problem. See, it's a little bit brown on the bottom there, but you really didn't taste it. But to the eye, it might look a little brown, but I would have maybe flipped it a minute or 2 earlier. So it took about 7 minutes, would have been perfect. I let it go about 9. And then now that it's flipped over, you want to let it cook for a few minutes on this side too. It only takes about 5 minutes on the other side though. And then about 5 minutes on that heat again, you flip it over onto or invert it onto a plate. And look at that. Isn't that beautiful? That bubbling sugar on top that's caramelized in there with those walnuts have toasted too, and so they've kind of become fragrant. You can smell them a little bit there too, and that is just really a decadent looking dessert. You can serve it however you want. You let it cool off and you can just pull it apart. It goes great with a cup of coffee. It goes great with some milk. You can put it on a table if you're having a dinner party, and I guarantee your guests will love you for providing such an appetizer. I really had fun with it. I have a hard time. It should be about 4 servings out of it, but I really had a hard time stopping at a half of the whole pan. It was really delicious. Again, I'd like to thank the guys at weedgrowhub.com for sponsoring this episode. Check them out for their hazy summer promotional where you can get free seeds, free t-shirts, lots of other cool stuff. And tell them the RuffHouse sent you. Hope you enjoyed this episode of Cannabasics, how to make funky monkey bread. If you did, please hit the like button. Also, subscribe to RuffHouse Studios for more cannabis culture videos made just for you. This is Matt, your Cannabis Infused host for RuffHouse Studios. Thanks for watching.